Josh, can you explain to me what the appeal and irony of fresh start servers is and classic servers in games like New World and World of Warcraft?
Servers, or classic servers of fresh start servers, or classic servers of current MMORPGs. Everyone seems to be doing them and people seem to love them, but why? The MMORPG genre is known for long-term progression, constantly expanding storylines, constantly increasing stakes and power. The long-term adventure and consistent character growth was a major selling point of the genre, so why does everyone starts again from the beginning appeal to so many people? When most players are asked about the appeal of fresh start or classic servers for current MMORPGs, most people just say, oh, it's nostalgia. And while I'm absolutely sure nostalgia is a major part of it, it can't specifically be the only thing.
Nope.
What about players that weren't there at the start, that don't have the nostalgia? And is nostalgia enough to convince enfranchised players to lose tens of thousands of hours of progress?
If it was nostalgia only, Classic would have died soon after launch, but it was wildly successful.
Or to give up hundreds of potential hours of content from new expansions? What are the true reasons people go to fresh start or classic servers? Let's discuss. Welcome, I'm Josh Hayes and this is MMOpinion. Today we're talking about the appeal of fresh start servers or classic servers of current MMORPGs. As usual, a massive thank you to all the supporters on Twitch and Patreon.
Is there ever going to be a point that the font's too small? That there's too many people supporting Josh Hayes to pick out the names? Is it going to have to start scrolling like Narc and then it just scrolls faster and faster and faster? And also, I apologize to any of you that are over here. I got you. You're also in here. You're also important. This is why he uploads in 4K. Oh, it's not to see his handsome face, beautiful background, or amazing gameplay. It's to get more names on the screen.
Who allow me to keep making videos. More information on this at the end. Many major MMORPGs have jumped onto the nostalgia bandwagon and opened up classic servers, instances of the game with all the modern additions removed, letting players relive the experience they had all those years ago when they first joined. The most famous is probably World of Warcraft Classic, but a host of other games have followed suit. Aeon tried, Terra tried, Runes of Magic tried, EverQuest has multiple time-locked progression servers released throughout the year, RuneScape released Old School, which itself was updated enough that they've now had a poll discussing old school, and
there's also reset seasons and things. That's been really common in PvP-based things over the years. You know, PvP ranked seasons reset, but there are also like hard resets in things that are more RPG. Action RPGs like Diablo and Path of Exile, that's like a major component. That active resetting is like a core design philosophy.
Even New World, one of the more recent MMORPGs to release, has seen success with its fresh start servers. So I've gone back and played a few fresh start servers or classic servers for current MMORPGs, and I found 8 specific concepts or stages that you go through when you play a fresh start server that really enhance the feeling and make them worth playing. And then I found one major bit of irony related to this entire situation. So let's go back and break them down, starting with why would an enfranchised player willingly throw away tens of thousands of hours of progress on a single character to go back and start all over again? This is point 1. Many players are connected to the game as a whole more than their specific character. While MMORPGs are indeed long games and people put tens of thousands of hours into a specific character, you'll often find the connection any individual player has to a game isn't just to their character. It's to everything around their character, the game's graphics, the game's music, or the general community the game has created. The forums, the Discord chats, the guilds, the clans, the conventions, or the content on YouTube and Twitch.
And a lot of those things in the world, such as the various unlocks and quests and places you can go, a lot of those are really only meant to be designed by the game to be enjoyed once. And so you only get to be low level once. You only get to go through these zones once. And so if you have a connection with something, like a particular moment in the story or a particular reveal with the game itself, there is an element of that connection that is best enjoyed on a fresh start.
This means starting a fresh start forums, the Discord chats, the guilds, the clans, the conventions, or the content on YouTube and Twitch. This means starting a fresh start server or a classic server isn't actually starting completely from scratch. It's a new character, yes, with new skills, and the leveling experience is still ahead of you, but that's only a small part of the entire game experience. It's still the graphics you know and the music you recognize. It's a control scheme you're familiar with and a user interface you've grown comfortable with. It's the forums you know how to navigate and the community and content you've already been involved with and consumed before. It's the friends you've already made, going back to the moment when you made them. A fresh start or classic server isn't a complete restart. It isn't a foray into the once unknown. It is now a very known concept that you're going back and revisiting, and that nostalgia kick is definitely important. It's closer to replaying a favourite game from your childhood or rewatching a favourite film. You know what's going to happen. It's the process of experiencing it that is enjoyable. It's comforting. But what about the new players that weren't there at the start? Nostalgia isn't relevant to them, so what are they getting? Well, that leads us to the second point. New players can now experience the memories of the old players for themselves. Whenever I review an MMORPG, I always try and find something positive to say, but I will also find negative or critical things. And whenever I say negative or critical things, old-time players often respond with, "It wasn't always like this." They jump to defend their favourite game by telling me how great it used to be. And while they're probably being honest, I have to explain to long-time and franchised players, new players cannot play through your memories. They have to play the game as it is now. No matter how great it may have been for you, it's not great now. And
it also means that they get the benefits. And so if there's something about a game that is improved, if the new player experience improves, there is an advantage to letting them enjoy it. And so if they're having fun and they're like, what I love about this game is this aspect that the devs have improved with new players in mind, and you have been long frustrated with that, you telling them that it used to be garbage does not benefit that player. Leave them alone. Let them have their fun. And so when you have players that are having a lot of fun, I'm going to try getting into World of Warcraft lore for the first time. And there are a lot of people that have been burned by WoW lore in the past. But if with the upcoming expansion Dragonflight, WoW happened to do a very good job managing their lore, that means that my experience would likely be more positive than yours as a longtime player that's ignored that element of the game. And that's okay too. So it can cut both directions when it comes to somebody's first time experience in a game where that experience has been available and has possibly changed over time.
And as great as your old war stories sound, as fascinating as the guild tales you have are, new players can only listen to and pine for the adventure you had. They can't have it themselves. Fresh start servers or classic servers, however, do give new players that chance. A classic server does let a new player visit the memories of an old player because they're going to be able to play the same game, hear the same music, fight the same enemies, travel the same lands. Old players may indeed enjoy the nostalgia because they've been there before, but new players get to experience the game that old players have told them about in the way they remember it. So with old players enjoying nostalgia and new players getting to experience the game they've heard tales of, we come to point 3. The early game is often a more focused gameplay experience with less feature creep and a less convoluted plot. When a game first releases, especially an MMORPG game, it very rarely releases with everything finished. It won't have every skill it will ever have or every dungeon or raid, but it will often release with enough to be substantial. And this reduced amount of content can sometimes result in a more defined experience. The game may have fewer classes, but each class will feel focused on a certain gameplay style. There may be fewer mini-games or mechanical distractions or a simpler UI, and this means that the content that does exist to do feels more important and more substantial. While players may get through it quicker, they will remember it more intensely. Along with less mechanical bloat, you have less plot bloat. The plot and lore of a classic game will often feel much more focused and less convoluted. As an MMORPG grows, the plot gets added to and becomes messy, twisted back and forth. Power creep sets in for the big bad guy of that expansion. Or one of the worst writing mistakes, time travel gets added. The longer a game exists, the more developers need to add both mechanical and then plot devices to make the player feel challenged or relevant, and this very quickly becomes extremely overwhelming. Eventually, after years of feature creep and power creep and parasitic design and systems on top of systems on top of systems on top of bad guys on top of bad guys, it can be comforting to return to a much simpler gameplay loop.
Not to mention that if that gameplay loop has flaws or makes references to things that are not used, and future expansions or additions to the game do make use of those, you get a chance to enjoy that insight that you didn't know was insight. If they make reference to a particular place, but it is always a distant place that they use just kind of loosely as a turn of phrase, that may be a place that in a future expansion you have gone. And so you are hanging on that going, oh, you say it's great and you're explaining it to me, but I know it's great. I've already been there. And so there is this nice quality about it where it's a lot like if you got a chance to go back in time and meet your best friend or your spouse. You got to meet them for the first time, knowing in advance that they would be the person that meant so much to you years and years later.
Constant power creep is overwhelming, and it's nice to return to a much more basic time. If the player has been tasked with saving the world again and again from a constantly increasing series, a treadmill of godlike beings, each more powerful than the last, eventually you're going to become numb to this treadmill and stop caring about it. All the power in the universe means nothing when you know the next bad guy will be even more powerful, and every system the game tries to get you really excited for is going to lose its edge when you realise that's what every expansion does every time, and it will just be cast away when the next system comes along. It's nice to return to a simpler time when you know that the high-powered bad guy will remain the high-powered bad guy, and the systems you're investing time in will remain relevant.
This is actually a point that brings up why Arthur says, like, old games were better. That, like, you didn't yet know that you were going to clear 1,000 raid bosses. It was the 8th boss, and so it still felt substantial. It's a lot of why I think Brian is enjoying New World over Final Fantasy XIV, because ultimately, a lot of the frustrations he has with Final Fantasy XIV might one day happen in New World, but they have not happened yet.
It's hard to get invested in a dangerous plot or character systems when you know they'll be removed and replaced in a few months' time. But a low-level personal plot with simple but relatable systems, that can be engaging without being overwhelming. Saving a village can often feel better than saving the whole world because you can know and care about the people in the village. It's a personal thing. While saving the whole world, that's an impersonal thing. Along with a simpler plot and simpler, more distilled systems comes Point 4. Smaller numbers are easier to track and can feel more substantial when you increase them. One of the downsides of power creep is the easiest way to make a player feel powerful is to simply increase a damage number, or to give them more health or more power, and this over time leads to absurd numbers showing up on the screen. I remember when Neverwinter had damage numbers in the tens of millions flashing up all over the screen, and this can become visually and numerically overwhelming.
Not to mention that World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy have both addressed that this becomes harder to deal with. Final Fantasy literally said that it was getting to the point where it was messing with their ability to generate power in the game. That they were having bugs that happened when a boss that was designed to be taken on by a large number of players' life got so large that their computing system was literally having trouble tracking numbers that large. So you end up with something where World of Warcraft talked a lot about when they did the level squish and damage squish, taking it back to this idea where a role-playing game where every level matters, not just having levels bloat, where eventually you end up with so many levels that new players are either overwhelmed or each level doesn't matter, and veteran players look back and remember each level specifically. They then compress everybody back down from 120 to 60, and I thought that was a really good move, and it's why I was very frustrated when I found out that the upcoming Dragonflight expansion would simply go from 60 to 70, and it felt like the devs became aware of a problem, found a solution to a problem, created a dynamic and reasonable solution to that problem, following a very logical train of thought, and then simply said, you know what, I probably won't be working on this game when it's a problem again anyway, and literally just put it back on the path to the same thing. They put the train up, they put it on an earlier point in the track, and they kicked it back down the line, so it's going to crash into the same mountain, but that's a problem for those people. And so it just felt like there's this moment, there's this idea, this like turn of phrase that's this ancient wisdom that says, a good man plants a tree, a great man plants a tree that he knows he will never sit under the shade. The idea that they created a problem, then created a solution, but were not willing to deal with the pain points, the criticism, and the backlash of that solution simply because they likely would not be around to see when that solution became a good idea felt really short-sighted. And it's incredibly infuriating to see them make a choice that says, who cares? Who cares? It's not my problem. I won't be here anyway. We're all guilty of it. I bought this house that I live in right now as an old house that needed all new ceiling fans. And putting new ceiling fans in a house across the entire house can add up really, really quickly. My wife and I weren't doing that great on money at the time, considering we had just spent a lot of it buying a house. And so what we decided to do was buy cheap ceiling fans. We planned on living in this house for 2 years and then moving on to another house. And we were going to renovate the parts of this house that were its biggest pain point, hopefully turn a small profit, and roll that into a house that was a better fit. Now, many years later, as I'm sure many of you that have owned a house can deal with, this is not an uncommon thing, we still live here. And now, this ceiling fan right here turns on, but the light does not. The ceiling fan in my bedroom turns on. Sometimes the light does, sometimes the light does not. Now, because of my short-sighted feelings buying a non-reputable ceiling fan, I am now dealing with those problems because I made a poor choice and said, sucks to be that guy from the future. And now that guy from the future is me.
But the start of an MMO is often a different story. You'll have low health, low defense, and do less damage, and this means dealing with smaller numbers, and this actually has a massive advantage, because an increase to a small number is easy to track and relate to, and it feels much more substantial than an increase to a large number. For example, getting a new weapon and going from, say, 10 damage to 12 damage is simple yet pleasing. It's a base number increase that you can track. It's only gone up by 2. But it's also a substantial percentage you can track. You've increased your damage output by 20%, and it's not too overwhelming to see the number 10 go to the number 12. Every single thing about this small increase is relevant and makes sense to you. You can look at every single aspect of it and go, yes, I understand everything that's just happened here, and I can see exactly how much more powerful I have become.
This is why horizontal systems in games that are over 10 years old start to look like they may have had the right idea all along. When you see World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy start down this road, and you see New World, we don't know what they're going to do yet. Ashes, we don't know what they're going to do yet. The Riot MMO, we don't know what they're going to do yet. But when you start to move down a vertical progression road, it doesn't matter whether you move down that road slowly or quickly. Ultimately, what you were saying is one day this will be a problem if we are lucky enough and successful enough to survive to one day. If we can make it far enough into the future, this will be a problem. Thankfully, I guess, for many MMOs that have a vertical progression system, is they don't make it to that day. Many games fail before that ever becomes a problem. Maybe it would have been a problem in WildStar, maybe it wouldn't. It did not live long enough for it to become one. But Guild Wars, who has stuck to their guns and time again has released expansions or things that would be considered a DLC through their living season system, has continued to never say, wouldn't it be cool if a new, more powerful weapon was added to the game? A new, more powerful armor was added to the game. They have stuck to their guns and they have kept it horizontal, which means that now they have never had to deal with the problem he's describing. This is something that once you enter a vertical progression road, once you say that a bigger, badder enemy will drop a bigger, more awesome piece of loot, you are now committed to doing that over and over and over, and you will eventually have the problem he's describing and have to roll back to a classic state or have a stat squish or have numbers that are too big to matter.
But seeing your damage output go from 12,478,397.2 to 12,693,555.4 doesn't have the same impact on our brains, but why? Well, it's because we recognize it as an increase, but we don't know exactly how much it's increased by. We don't know what kind of percent increase it is easily, and because the vast majority of the damage number is the same, starting with 12 million and several 100,000, we don't actually feel the rush of excitement we'd normally get from seeing an increase that we can track. Playing with numbers, both damage or defense or health or amount of enemies that large for such a long time almost numbs you to its power, dulls the thrill that an upgrade is meant to give. This is why getting your first uncommon or rare item on a low-level character often feels so much better than getting your 2000th legendary.
I still have my Twig of the World tree from vanilla World of Warcraft. It was the first substantial weapon that I had, that I made it all the way to cap, and it was still equipped because I didn't find better. It felt like a big moment. There were things I got before that, but they were all fine, I guess. And for some reason, that Mardon drop felt important to me. And so I kept it, and it sits in my bank to this day because it feels important. I have gotten legendaries since then, all sorts of epics, relics that are supposed to be descended from the very gods themselves.
Because you can see and understand every element of the small upgrade that you got. And with that personal sense of trackable upgrade and achievement, we get to point 5. Fewer cosmetics means visual recognition of the best. With smaller damage numbers and a simpler plot comes the rather nice community aspect of recognizing things. You can recognize the bad guys and the good guys, and if the first dungeon drops a powerful, unique looking weapon, when you see someone with that weapon, you recognize the achievement of that weapon. You know roughly how much damage it does, where it came from, and this knowledge makes you as a player feel accomplished and part of the world. Even if you don't have the item yourself, the act of recognizing it and understanding it still feels like an achievement. You belong in this world.
Yeah, I never got a Burning Brightwood staff, and yet I know what they were, and I know that my brother found 2, and I just... There are these moments where I track specific things that I don't track any longer.
Because you understand this world. Classic MMOs didn't focus too heavily on cosmetics or payable cosmetic overrides. Often the item you equipped was the visuals that others would see, and this leads to a community understanding the value and the prestige behind the visuals of each item.
It's why glows are important. In World of Warcraft, back in vanilla, it was very hard to get a glow, and so people would put Beast Slayer or whatever it was called on a weapon because it made that red glow, and that was really iconic. But now everything glows, so nothing matters. Final Fantasy has been very careful with the number of glows that have been added to the game over the years, and yet as we start to see things like a normal raid drop have a pretty crazy visual element, there is something to be lost there. There is something where there's going to be a day that there's going to be 3,000 items that glow and none of them will matter. Having iconic things is something that once you lose it, you cannot go back.
In older MMORPGs, often without visual overrides, the visual appearance of a character is a story unto itself. It's a tale of the adventures that character has been on, of the quests they've completed, or the bosses they have felled. It's a status symbol when you're seen with a rare or legendary item. If you have it, you know other people can see you with it, and if you see other people with it, you know what they have achieved. It's a moment to be remembered, and early MMORPGs excelled in this. You see something powerful, and you know the person wielding it did something dangerous. When you play a classic server, you're dealing with a far smaller pool of
Part of what he's also talking about there is bind on pickup. Part of what he's talking about is that that character achieved the thing to get that loot.
total possible items. And when you play a fresh start server, no one for the first few months is going to have the top level items. And this means far fewer legendaries or noteworthy items are floating around. So getting one and being seen with one, or seeing and recognizing someone else having one, holds greater social impact. And this links to point 6, because if you do have something rare and noteworthy, you will likely be seen, because a smaller landmass means a denser player base. This one's pretty simple. Map size, less landmass, players are forced into a central city, meaning the community feels alive in-game because it's centralized. As MMORPGs continue to exist, they add expansions, new landmasses, and sometimes they even add what I consider to be a major mistake of MMO design, exclusive high-level hub cities which serve to split the community, often into early game hub, mid game hub, and end game hub, fracturing where your player base physically is.
Yeah, and phasing does the same thing, right? Having a later version of it so that they don't see each other. A lot of these games, they don't go back and leverage older zones. They don't. And when they do it through something like Cataclysm, where it has to come through and fundamentally change it. Instead of saying, okay, in the early zones, we're down here in these little valleys, and then we're going to create things along the plateaus, they tend to just slowly lock you away. And so it feels like you spend an entire 2-year cycle in World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, in those late game zones, and then you never go back. It's something I really admire about Guild Wars. What's crazy is that Guild Wars is not my primary MMO, but the more I have these conversations, the more I find myself saying, Guild Wars is the one doing it right.
Classic or Fresh Start servers not only have less maps, so the community is densely packed, they often have an influx of players creating a thriving early game experience. And it's the early game experience for the vast majority of new players where the desire to continue playing is created. Starting a brand new MMORPG and knowing that you're going to be playing solo or alone for several days or weeks before you finally get to the good bit isn't a good experience. It's boring, it's lonely. It's the reason that many new players to any MMORPG will quit.
Yes, a ton of Final Fantasy players that have gone and tried WoW, as I've talked about it, have said, I tried it for 20 minutes or an hour and it wasn't my thing. And yet, I feel that when those people say that, if I told you that I had a friend from WoW try Final Fantasy for 20 minutes and decide that the entire game was not worth it, they would say, oh, well, you didn't stick it out to the good part. The fact that these games have such big initial grinds is crazy. It's insane that we ask people to go through that much, and the kind of player that it appeals to is not always the player who feels that they enjoy the end. So there are a lot of people who thrive in this story. They thrive in leveling all the characters up, but then as they get to the part where you're supposed to do this transition to Savage and crafting and gathering and chasing tomes, it's so intrinsically different than the portion that got to that point that it is not crazy that you have a lot of people, once they've leveled all their classes or they've cleared the story in a game, realize, I think I'm just going to go play something else. Because the thing they've been doing for the first 100, 200, 2,000 hours is so different than the thing that's now being asked of them. That's not weird. If you meet somebody in a bar who likes to go out dancing and drinking and party, and all you guys ever do while you date is dance and drink and party, and then you get engaged and you dance and you drink and you party, and then you get married and you want to have children and stay home and read books and deal with your garden and never dance or drink or party, it's not weird to think there is a chance that you're going to wake up next to that person one day and go, I don't think that we're good at this, because you are asking somebody to change on a dime. Final Fantasy XIV does this. Their endgame is drastically different than the experience that somebody will have for their first hundreds of hours. World of Warcraft rushes you through that because the endgame is so drastically different than what you will do while you level. How do you make a game feel like, yes, it is a lower stakes, lesser version designed to teach you and introduce you to the world, but that from the get-go, the core gameplay loop is something that is foundationally similar from the beginning to the end when a game is not in its first 6 months, 1 year, 2 years? How do you have somebody playing content that is 10 years old and is still in the same game loop if you are not hitting the reset button for veterans? If you have players whose characters are 10 and 15 years old, how do you have those players feeling rewarded in the very same game that somebody is starting today? It's not an easy question to answer.
Selling your game on the strengths of the social interaction you can have within the game, and then starting with hours, days, or weeks of loneliness before you get to the social interaction bit, is not a good way to retain a player base. It helps to have the social aspect visible from the start if you're going to use that as a major selling point of your genre, and that is exactly what Fresh Start servers allow the game to do. Because every player is at the start.
Yes.
The release of a classic or fresh start server is a beacon of activity. It's an assurance that your early game experience will be social because players haven't spread out yet. As MMORPGs grow and expansions are released, the player base is spread further apart, fragmented and divided among new maps, new dungeons, new raids and new areas.
That's why the Burning Crusade Classic had to sell boost potions, even though the original one did not. The community was so good at flying through to the Burning Crusade that it would not have been the experience that was available in the Burning Crusade for people that started in the classic areas. The Burning Crusade was a massive growth tool for the game. Wrath of the Lich King was a massive growth tool for the beginning of the game. And so I had multiple friends that I gained that started back then, and they leveled through those zones with a lot of other people. Classic servers.
Boy, howdy. Back in my day, I remember one. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Be a big one.
Oh, yeah. Classic servers like Anarchy, classically supporting us for 17 months. Those classic servers ended up adding something where that was no longer the case. Players had pushed along, and so it was no longer this spread caravan moving through the content. There was a big wave, a tidal wave at the beginning clearing the content, and then there were all these stragglers spread out through the early zones. So they chose to monetize selling the ability to jump past that, because if your goal was to relive or for the first time experience the Burning Crusade, that was your goal, not to re-experience the vanilla zones. If your goal or experience was to relive Wrath of the Lich King, what does that have to do with leveling through Tirisfal Glades? You want to be in those zones. So that is why they're done differently. Hashtag no changes is still changes.
And even if an expansion adds a new hub city and puts everyone there, it leaves vast tracts of game uninhabited. When an MMORPG is released, the content included often serves a purpose. The enemies fill a specific level gap, the weapons and armor matter. The quests usually connect, there's not as much wasted space, and nothing has yet been phased out or leveled out. There's almost no forgotten content because it literally just released, and someone is going to go and do everything because everything appeals to someone. There are very few forgotten minigames or pointless weapons. No content has yet been feature crept out of relevance. And because a fresh start means everyone starts together, this gives us one of the most important points.
And honestly, New World, the non-fresh start servers are still less than 2 years old. So this is still largely true of New World right now. But when people tell me that based on the fact that New World, which is a year and a half old, is going to have these things be true 10 years from now, just feels naive.
Point 7. Anticipation is fun. And the group you can anticipate a fresh start with is everyone. The release of something is not just about release day, it's about all of the build-up to release day, talking with your friends about it, planning your tactics, discussing builds, looking into the plot and the lore and the characters. It's every minute up to the download and then the login queue. Now, when a long-time MMORPG releases a high-level expansion, the pool of people who can get excited about that event and actually get involved is very small. If a new high-level endgame raid is announced, the only people forming groups and getting excited about it are current high-level endgame players of that game.
This is where the World of Warcraft pre-patch model thrives. They boost everybody's experience, they encourage people to get into the game, long-time returners, brand new players, and because their expansions can be played in whatever order you want, they have the advantage of saying, if you hop in now, you can get caught up in time for the expansion, and this expansion can be yours on day one if you want it to be, as opposed to something like Final Fantasy that, in trade for having a more meaningful, cohesive narrative element, has said if you want to be around for 7.0, you would need to start that weeks, possibly months in advance, because when Endwalker launched, a lot of people tried to hop in, and this was before they banned the sales of the game. And there were a lot of people that said, what would it take for me to get in? A lot. A lot.
Usually people with years invested. They can't bring their friends in. But When an extremely high-level piece of content is announced for an MMORPG game, the pool of people who can get excited about that content or get involved with that content the moment it releases is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. Thousands, tens of thousands, if you are lucky.
And he brought up this point that I think was really valid in another video that says that is why the beginning of a game, the beginning of a book, the beginning of a story should be better than the end. Not because you don't want the end to be good, and not because you don't want the middle to be good, but because everybody who plays that thing, everybody who consumes that content sees the beginning. But the further you go into it, the less people make it. And so why would you make your best thing at the end or in the middle? Why would you say it gets good later? It should be good now, at the beginning, even if it gets worse as it goes. The Game of Thrones is something that, yes, in the end, ended up something that many people were frustrated by, but we all got to enjoy the beginning when it was amazing, instead of something like Final Fantasy XIV, which I love. It is my primary MMO, but there are a lot of people that said, I tried that game in A Realm Reborn and I couldn't move on, and the community's response is push through it, it gets better. But ultimately, those people were not wrong for giving up. So you want the good part to be something that everybody can get to.
When a brand new Fresh Start server gets announced, or a classic server gets announced, the amount of people who can get involved, the pool of people to get excited, is in the millions. Everyone who's ever played the game, everyone who ever wanted to play the game, casuals, hardcore, high level, low level, enfranchised, or people who've never been involved with the game at all, can all join on equal footing at the same moment and begin playing the game together. A Fresh Start server, compared to a high level update, vastly increases the number of people who can get excited to be involved the moment it goes live. This is why companies like the idea of Fresh Start or classic servers so much. They're not releasing new content to people who already play their game, which is a very small, very niche player base. They're releasing old content to potentially everyone who ever wanted to play the game as it used to be, with everyone starting on a new character. And this leads us to point 8. A fresh start means a new race to the top. As we discussed earlier, a classic or fresh start server doesn't mean you're approaching the game with no knowledge at all. Long-time players will know the meta. They'll know the most efficient method of play.
This is something that is important about the appeal. There is a sport, I guess we'll call it a sport, called High Rocks. So High Rocks, if I go to the images, right here, High Rocks is a physical sport that can appeal to everybody from a person who's just begun taking care of themselves and wants to have a goal to work towards, to elite athletes. And what High Rocks is a series of 8 physical events, and in between each one, a 1 kilometer run totaling to 8 total laps, roughly 5 miles. And so what you end up with is something that appeals to everybody. But if you go look at similar sports, something like CrossFit. The CrossFit Open is the similar idea, and CrossFit is designed to become something that everybody can enjoy. What CrossFit offers is the ability for people to go through a series of open-based workouts that are designed to create a lot of variety for people that are invested in that style of fitness. But because nobody is doing the same thing every time, ultimately, it is hard to know when you are looking at the elite athletes how good they really are. If they can pull 160 calories on the ski erg, I don't know if that's a lot or a little, as opposed to if all people are pulling a flat 1,000 meters on the ski erg, I can tell that they did it faster than me, and therefore I can see how much better than me they really are. If you've ever done something like watched a race, maybe you watch the Olympics, or you watch the Tour de France, or you've gone and witnessed a friend running a marathon, the people who are in the back look slower. They look worse. They're behind. And it doesn't feel good to be those people if you are a competitive person. Your first time through, you might just be excited to be there. I just finished my first triathlon. I just finished my first Murph. This year has been a major move forward in me taking part in things I've never done before. And I've had friends asking me, am I interested in taking place in something like the CrossFit Open or in High Rocks? And these are things I have no experience with, am not qualified to do, and I would have an amazing sense of accomplishment if I achieved these. But ultimately, it would not feel good to see somebody else be wildly far ahead of me. And this is where something like a Fresh Start server operates much closer to High Rocks, because the way High Rocks works is they start people in heats, and those heats are just made up of 20 or 30 people, and they are all over the different age ranges and skill ranges, which means there are different people at different stations, and you're all running the same 1 kilometer lap around these things. It takes place in a big area in the middle, and people run in a lap, and so it's not easy to tell who's winning and who's losing during the event. That is true of a Fresh Start server. In a Fresh Start server, everybody's enjoying their own pace, and the people who have knowledge and are doing this race to the top, and the people who are experiencing it for their first time, are all having fun alongside each other. And you can't tell how many hours somebody's put in or what build decisions they've made, because we're all localized to the exact same thing at the exact same time. It's not as obvious how far behind somebody really is. And so that allows the new player to feel welcome and be part of the community instead of having it lorded over them just how far they have yet to go.
New players will have access to wikis and YouTube videos. All long-time players will know the meta. They'll know the most efficient method of play. New players will have access to wikis and YouTube videos and training methods. But with everyone at least starting from level 1 and access to information the same for everyone, we get to watch the start of a new race for new world firsts. Some players chase the prestige of epic achievements, the first to max level, the first guild to clear a dungeon or a raid, the first to max a skill. And when that achievement happens, you'll have a small subset of players who were only playing for that, who just stop playing. As an MMO ages, more and more achievements are added, and you get this double-edged sword effect, where the new world firsts are now incredibly tough and appeal only to the hardcore. And the new players who join the game are overwhelmed by the absolute colossal task of finishing everything in the game. An MMORPG is of course a big game, but there is a sweet spot where the average 2 dedicated player could still look at the content and have a somewhat realistic chance of experiencing it all, or at least attempting to, even if not mastering it. As the game grows,
And there's something nice about experiencing it all being from a big enough buffet line that if you don't like a particular type of content, like you don't like PvP, that it all can still be, I want to experience everything but the PvP, and that there's still enough choices. One of the appeals of MMORPGs is if 1 or 2 or even 10 types of content do not appeal to you, that there's still enough meat on the bone to enjoy it. And that's important because you're sharing this game with other people. And so if I'm in a raid group with friends who also like raiding, but then some like story, some like PvP, some like jump puzzles, some like crafting and gathering, we can share those moments we share together, but in the rest of our playtime, we can all go to the buffet and only do the things that appeal to us, and nobody feels like this game doesn't have any content.
Casual player will look at the mountain of a journey ahead of them and think this isn't even worth starting. This is why so many players are intimidated by Final Fantasy XIV's main storyline quest, or completionists go wide-eyed looking at the trimmed completionist cape on RuneScape, or why many Guild Wars 1 players, especially people starting the game for the first time now, don't even consider going for God walking amongst mere mortals.
This is why Guild Wars 2 players regularly recommend to a new player that the first thing you do is not to chase a legendary. Not because it's not for you ever, but because it wasn't designed for you at this point in your journey. Do some other things first, get your feet wet in a lot of different game modes, get used to how the game works generally, and then maybe you can consider taking one bite at a time to consume the elephant that is a legendary grind.
Achievements are indeed there for the hardcore, and a fresh start server means even the easy achievements are now up for grabs, and everyone thinks, on at least some level, that could be me. So now we've got 8 points all discussing the appealing nature of Fresh Start or Classic servers. It's a nostalgic return for old players to a world they've known, or a welcome storied start for the new players to a world they've heard about, with a more focused plot and less bloated gameplay, with fewer parasitic or feature-crept systems, with smaller but more substantial numbers linked to visually significant and recognisable items shown to a more densely packed player base, which you can get excited about and anticipate with everyone, and then compete from a level playing field at the same time for realistic, achievable goals. Now that sounds pretty fun, so what's the irony? Well, the MMORPG genre was focused on long-term progression, and now they've discovered the mass appeal of resetting the game and starting again.
And if the only thing that is good about your game is that it's new, that's a temporary state.
Effectively, what they've discovered is the appeal of round 1 ending and round 2 beginning, like a match in Fortnite, or a new game in League of Legends, or replaying your favourite childhood game, or a one-shot Dungeons and Dragons adventure, or watching a TV series which starts well but trails off and just going back to the start when it gets bad. The Fresh Start or Classic server of any MMORPG is often extremely fun, but it's also a sign that the MMORPG designers understand the mass appeal of experiences which end and then start again. It's a sign that most MMORPGs add content that doesn't necessarily improve the core gameplay loop, but just bloats.
It's admitting the truth that a lot of the things you added were not objectively only improvements to the game. That everything you added came with a pro and a con, and eventually those cons added up. Now, not admitting it just puts you in denial because it's true either way, but it is admitting that at some point you realize that the game you make now is not necessarily objectively better than the game you made before.
Experiences are as long as they need to be and shouldn't add more for the sake of adding more, and I find it intensely ironic that the strength of the MMORPG genre is it's a long-term consistent game which people could play forever, yet it's most appealing to both its current and new players when it restarts. But what do you think? Do Fresh Start or Classic servers return to a more refined time before power creep and feature bloat to give a more pure experience of what each game was meant to be with a more densely packed player base? Or are they...
I think more appealing starts to be where I differentiate, is that it's more appealing across the board. To a veteran player, adding more to the veteran is great. To a new player, adding more to the new player experience and giving everybody an equal footing is great. What a classic server has that's unique is it has the ability to appeal to both. So when we start to view success economically, the number of people it appeals to, it's more total people. Does that therefore make it better? If Endwalker is praised by all the people that cleared it, but of the people that cleared it, that's only 20% of the people who ever enjoy Final Fantasy XIV, is it still good content? I would argue yes to that 20%, but no to the 80% that never made it. So where do you define good versus bad, as opposed to a Fresh Start server has the chance to capture all 100%?
They simply cash grabs for nostalgia, preying on people's rose-tinted memories? Let me know in the comments below. As always, a massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon.
I think that the irony of it is that you are hinging the good part off of it being the beginning. And that beginning is a statement of a point in time, not a particular long-term living thing. It's something ephemeral. It's something that moves. It fades. And so with New World, for example, they just added Fresh Start servers, but their existing servers aren't that old. So as they talk about server merges, they said that new servers would only be allowed to merge with new servers. But if you have a game that's less than 2 years old, and it already has servers that are being sectioned off as being new, how long will they be considered new? Because it sounds like the word new will always mean a number smaller than 24 months. So what happens when yet again they need to release more new start servers? Do the previous new start servers have to hand in their new name tags so that they can be used for the old ones? Does that then merge them in with everybody else? Or do they become middle-aged servers? So where do we start to section off what is new and what is not? The other thing about fresh start servers is people consume things way too fast, because as he noted, the knowledge and the training of everybody else is wildly up there. And so you have people that are just crushing this. They consume content very, 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 very fast. And so a game that was satisfied by a patch cycle that was every 4 months might now need to a new fresh start server need to release that patch content at a rate of every 2 months, which means that it is consuming content faster than it did when it was brand new and nobody knew how to kill that particular boss or find that particular item. And so as people run right to the best spot and level up in just the best way, you need to release content faster and faster and faster every time you hit restart, unless you're going to do something that meaningfully changes it. If you hashtag no change it, then you have to release the content very fast, which means now you are 5 years in the future when the fresh start starts, but they are consuming time faster than you. So what do you do when the fresh start server catches up with the current timeline? Do you let them just catch up? Do they have to at some point fragment off and take their own take on things? Do you just keep hitting restart every time you hit a particular point? Something that action RPGs have tried with seasonal content is, what if we add modifiers? What if we slowly add new items, or we manipulate the world in a particular way? If now we play through, but we change the balance on the way particular classes work, or we start to say, all the monsters for this 3 months are going to explode, but they don't normally, does that change people's experience where it is familiar yet new? And at the end of that 3 months, you hit reset again, and now you say all of the monsters in the world are going to have poison applied to them, and you just slowly manipulate that. Do you instead go back and make a key decision differently? If when you got to a particular point, you made a choice with a loot system or a story element or something about the game that intrinsically changed it forever, and you were given a choice to go left or right, do you get to that point with the fresh start server and take the road less taken? What do you do and how do you do it is something that new start servers have not yet solved, as we go into a meta where more and more games are coming out as remakes, remasters, fresh starts, classics, whatever they want to call it. How do we handle this when new is no longer the new? How do we handle this when we've been getting fresh starts and new start servers for 10 years? What will that meta turn into? And that's the thing we have not yet navigated that I hope to see from the format.